The kettle hissed softly behind me as I wiped the dust from my mother's teacup. I hadn't used it in years. It used to sit proudly on the sideboard, a tiny crown in our kingdom of quiet things. Now it hid behind detergent bottles, next to half-used candles, and someone else's instant coffee. Downstairs, laughter broke out. High-pitched, unfamiliar. They were hosting again. The thud of suitcase wheels scraped across the old wooden floor. I knew that sound. It wasn't family. It was Airbnb. I stepped to the edge of the stairwell, watching the golden light from below flicker through the banister. Then came her voice, my daughter's voice. Sweet. Polished. Oh, that? Just the housekeeper. She lives upstairs. Something inside me didn't break. It receded. Like tide pulling back, leaving the shore quiet, bare, unprotected. She called me the housekeeper. I closed the door to the attic slowly, not to creak the hinges, not to interrupt their cocktails. Back in my room, the kettle had gone quiet. The radio buzzed, then crackled into static. I turned the dial gently, settling on a jazz station that Bruno used to hum along to while sanding window frames. There were no windows up here, only a small skylight, and the sound of heels clicking on the stairs. I built with my husband's hands. This was once our home. Now it was a listing, a curated experience, with fresh towels and no memory of me. They forgot who paid for it all. But I hadn't forgotten a thing. Not the smell of the cedar Bruno carved into the banister. Not the way Jillian used to fall asleep on the rug beside the fireplace. Not the moment we carried in the first dining chair, laughing because it didn't fit through the door. They erased all of that, with throw pillows and mood lighting. But memory isn't something you throw away. It lingers. It waits. And I was done waiting. The first thing Bruno built in this house wasn't a wall or a stair. It was a window. A wide, slightly crooked frame made of salvaged oak. He found behind an abandoned warehouse. He carried the wood home on his shoulder, shirt damp with effort, and spent every evening sanding it smooth. While the summer light faded through the back porch screen, he didn't say much, but he worked with a kind of quiet joy that made the silence feel full. When he finished, he stood back, brushed the dust from his palms, and said, "There, now your paintings will never sit in the dark." That room became my sanctuary. It smelled of linseed oil and dry lilacs. The walls wore stains of color from years of painting, and the windowsill was chipped from leaning too hard in thought. Jillian used to lie on the floor beside me, drawing her own little worlds. Her fingers smudged with charcoal, her cheeks pink from the sunbeam that hit the rug just right. She loved yellow back then. Said it made everything look like morning. She called the studio the quiet room. Because, she told me once, that's where we didn't need to talk. To feel loved. I remember those afternoons, as if they were folded between the pages of my skin. But now, the room feels blank. Last week, Jillian stood in the studio with a measuring tape, eyeing the walls as if they were in her way. "These pieces are too busy, Mom," she said, pointing at my sketches. "Let's simplify. Neutral tones photograph better." She didn't ask. She decided. She removed the framed portrait of Bruno, the one I drew when he was sanding the banister, back bent, jaw clenched in focus. She set it face down on the table. Didn't say a word. I wrapped it gently in an old sweater and carried it to the attic. Its glass was cool against my chest. Later that night, I passed the kitchen. The cabinets were stripped. The spice jars gone. Even the faded recipe card from my mother was missing. Jillian's voice drifted in. "I told the contractor to knock this wall out. We need more flow." I stood there, bare feet on cold tile, staring into a room I no longer recognized. They called it a renovation, but it felt like an eviction. From memory itself. They were creating space. They said. But for what? And for whom? The boxes started appearing one by one. Plain, brown, unassuming. But their silence was loud. At first, I thought they were for holiday decorations. Then I saw the label. To donate, miscellaneous. Jillian didn't ask. She sorted. She wrapped things in newspaper like they were fragile but forgettable. I walked into the dining room and found her folding up the lace tablecloth. The one my grandmother crocheted by hand. Before her eyesight failed. I figured we could freshen up the table. She said. Glass top, maybe something cleaner. She smiled like she was doing me a favor. Next, she pulled my mother's teacups from the hutch. Thin porcelain with gold trim. She tapped one with her fingernail. They don't match anything else, Mom. And nobody really drinks tea anymore. I opened my mouth. Then closed it again. The plates followed. Then the candlesticks. Then the small hand mirror Bruno gave me on our 10th anniversary. It was tarnished. But his initials were still carved into the back. She wrapped it in old newspaper. And dropped it into a box marked bedroom, unused. I stood in the hallway. Watching my life disappear. In layers of cardboard and tape. Derek walked by, carrying another bin. Don't worry, we're keeping the important stuff, he said. As if that helped. Important to whom? I found the box labeled. Office. Old papers. Tucked in the corner later that night. Inside were lesson plans from my final years at the high school. Thank you notes from students. A few dried flowers pressed between grade books. On top sat a folder with Bruno's name in faded ink. I opened it with shaking fingers. Inside was the original sketch he made of the house. Floor by floor. Room by room. Drawn in pencil so soft it looked like smoke. Each room was labeled by memory. Studio, for H. Dining, Sunday laughs. Stairs, Jay's first steps. It wasn't just a blueprint. It was a love letter. I held it to my chest. The paper thin as a breath. The label on the box had a red checkmark. Ready to go. I stood in that dark hallway, with the folder pressed to my ribs, and realized something terrible. They weren't just clearing out the house. They were clearing out the evidence. Evidence that I had lived here. That I had mattered. That my hands, too, had built something no renovation could replace. I didn't sleep that night. The folder stayed on my lap. Long after the rest of the house went quiet. I turned each page slowly. Like peeling back layers of myself. Each sketch, each note Bruno scribbled in the margins. They weren't just blueprints. They were a map of what we had built. And of what we had believed in. I touched the pencil lines that shaped the studio. Remembering the day he traced the room's edges. With a level clutched in his calloused hands. He wrote H's sunlight near the window. A small arrow pointing to where the light came in every afternoon. I hadn't noticed that line before. I read it 3 times. Then I folded the page back. Like someone closing a prayer book. Downstairs, a drawer slammed. I heard Jillian's voice. Low and brisk. As she spoke to someone on speakerphone. Yeah, we'll remove the archway, open it up more. She doesn't really use that part of the house anyway. That part of the house. I had cooked there for 40 years. My feet had learned the shape of every floorboard. My back had bent with the weight of family dinners. Of birthdays. Of grief. Of laughter. But now it was just layout. Flow. Square footage. I walked downstairs slowly. As if stepping through a museum that had once been mine. She was sorting mail. Discarding envelopes without reading them. Anything important? I asked. She didn't look up. Just junk. And bills. She picked up the photo box next. The one Bruno carved from cedar. She opened it with a casual flick of the wrist. And photos spilled out like forgotten seasons. Most of these aren't labeled. She murmured. It's hard to tell who's who. She held one up. It was me, holding Jillian at 2 years old. Jam on her cheeks. Flour on my apron. You look younger, she said. Tilting her head. Almost like someone else. I didn't answer. I just took the photo from her hand. And held it. Later, when the house emptied out, I gathered what I could. The blueprint, the photo, the old mirror. I climbed to the attic. Behind Bruno's cedar chest, I lifted the loose floorboard. The wood creaked soft, tired, familiar. I placed the items inside and covered them with a wool shawl. Not hidden out of fear, but out of reverence. If they couldn't remember who I was, then I would teach the house too. The music started around 5. At first, it was soft, barely more than a rhythm, pressing through the floorboards like a breath. I paused mid-fold, a towel still warm in my hands, and listened. Laughter followed light, practiced. Then a voice I didn't know said, "To love, and to years well spent." Glasses clinked. I looked at the calendar beside my bed. June 17. Red ink circled the date. Bruno and I were married on this day, 47 years ago. We'd worn secondhand clothes and danced barefoot in the kitchen, with flour on our sleeves. He gave me one daisy in a glass bottle, said it was all he could afford, and all I'd ever need. That night, we toasted with root beer. The only champagne we had was laughter. Today, there was no toast. At least not one I was invited to. Downstairs, the floor shifted under unfamiliar footsteps. I heard a door swing open. More laughter. Someone said, "It's perfect, exactly the vibe I was hoping for." I sat on the edge of the attic bed, teacup in hand. The rim was chipped. The tea had gone cold. The air smelled like lemon-scented cleaner. And something else. Rosé. I wondered what they were celebrating. Then I heard it. "Happy anniversary to us," a woman said with theatrical cheer. Then, "I can't believe it's been 5 years already." 5 years. Bruno had only been gone for 7. So that meant this place had become theirs, almost as quickly as it stopped being ours. No one had said a word. Not even Jillian. Not even this morning. I reached under the bed and pulled out the old shoebox where I kept cards. One still had Bruno's handwriting. "To my H. For the love you give even when I forget to ask for it." The paper smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. Downstairs, a chair scraped across the dining floor. Music swelled again, something jazzy. Sinatra. I used to hum it while washing dishes. Bruno tapped the spoon to the beat. They didn't know. They didn't ask. They danced on a floor where we once cried. They poured wine in a room where we prayed. And I sat upstairs. A relic. Still breathing. But no longer included in the story this house now told. The next morning, I came down early. The hallway was still, carrying the faintest scent of last night's wine. And something sweet I didn't recognize. The table in the dining room was set again. 4 place settings. All matching. Napkins folded into precise triangles. Candle untouched. But the chair, the one I always used, with the floral cushion, Bruno, stitched by hand, was gone. In its place stood a new one. Sleek, gray, with sharp lines, and no memory. I stared at it longer than I meant to. Jillian walked in, dressed in something clean and casual, but already on her phone. She followed my eyes. "Oh," she said, almost absently. "I moved your chair to the corner. This one fits the aesthetic better." Aesthetic. That word again. Not comfort. Not sentiment. Just aesthetic. I sat down anyway. It was firm and cold, and made a soft creak I didn't recognize. Jillian handed me a mug. Plain white. Thick rim. No saucer. The coffee was black. I hadn't drunk it that way since 1984. When I was pregnant and couldn't keep cream down. But she didn't ask. She didn't remember. "Are you okay, Mom?" The words came like a reflex. The way people say, "Bless you," to an empty sneeze. I nodded. It was easier than the truth. Easier than saying. I felt like a borrowed object. Returned to the wrong shelf. Derek came in moments later. His voice was light, practiced. He kissed Jillian on the temple. Then turned to me. "Morning, Helen." Just that. Helen. He used to call me Mom. Especially when Jillian wasn't around. He called me that the night he asked for her hand. Voice shaking. Eyes sincere. Now he said my name. Like it belonged on a guest list. They began chatting over my head. About availability for the next weekend. A couple from Portland. A photographer and her husband. He liked antiques. She liked open space and natural light. I looked around at the room I once ruled. The walls had been repainted. The mirror was gone. The old clock didn't tick anymore. It felt like a stage, set for someone else's story. And I was the forgotten prop. Left behind between scenes. It took me 2 days to notice the wall. Or rather, to notice what was no longer on it. The hallway that connected the kitchen to the den. I used to hold a collection of frames. A timeline in pictures. Our life told in glances and light. Bruno always called it the spine of the house. On that wall was our wedding photo. Black and white. A little crooked in its frame. But Bruno said it looked more alive that way. Next to it, Jillian's first dance recital. Her front tooth missing. Her cheeks red from excitement. Me in the garden. Wearing a hat too big for my head. And gloves too thin for the weeds. Bruno, in the workshop. A pencil behind his ear. Measuring something that would never quite be level. But always be loved. They were all gone. In their place. 3 canvas prints. Beige, abstract. Blurred circles. No people. No names. I stood there in silence. My eyes fixed on the blankness. No one had said a word. No one had asked if I wanted them taken down. I reached out. Let my fingers hover over the wall. Where the wedding photo used to hang. There was still a faint outline in the paint. The ghost of a frame. Too stubborn to disappear completely. Jillian passed behind me. She didn't stop. She said softly. Without turning her head. The wall felt too cluttered. It didn't match the new flow of the space. Then she added. As if it made things better. They're not gone, just packed. We're keeping them safe. I nodded. Because that's what was expected. But the silence between us was no longer neutral. It had weight. It had edges. That evening, I found the photo box in the garage. Under holiday wreaths and unused yoga mats. The wedding picture lay beneath layers of tissue paper. Face down. I lifted it out. The glass was smudged. One corner chipped. But we were still there. Bruno's hand on mine. My smile, not yet tired. I wrapped the frame in a quilt. The one from our first winter. And carried it upstairs. Back to the attic. Back to the only room. Where memory hadn't been redecorated. And when I placed the frame beside the cedar chest, I realized. They hadn't just moved the pictures. They had moved me. Out of the story. Quietly. Completely. And I had to choose. Would I keep fading? Or find a way to be remembered on my own terms? It started with a letter. Plain white envelope. Standard size. No handwriting, just machine print. It was tucked between flyers and a real estate brochure. I almost didn't notice it. The name on the front wasn't even mine. It said, to the current resident. But the return address, that caught my eye. It was from the bank Bruno and I had used for over 40 years. I opened it at the kitchen counter. The morning light dull through the blinds. Steam rose from my cup. But I hadn't taken a sip. Inside were 3 lines that changed everything. This letter confirms the successful transfer of property ownership. From Cardillo, Helen M. To Nelson, Derek J. As recorded with King County Assessor's Office. I froze. The heat from the mug disappeared from my fingers. I read it again. Then again. My eyes stopped at my own name. Not because it was there, but because of where it wasn't anymore. I was no longer the owner of this house. I looked at the bottom of the page. There it was. No further action required. So clean. So final. Like the sweep of a cloth over a dusty shelf. I walked to the sink. Letter still open. My hands trembling. I tried to remember when I'd signed anything. It must have been months ago. Jillian had brought over a stack of papers. She said it was just routine paperwork. To help with insurance, taxes, and something called streamlined management. I was tired that day. She stood beside me, pointing where to initial. Smiling. Rushing. I trusted her. I signed every page. She kissed my cheek afterward. Made me tea. We didn't talk about it again. Now, I stood in the same kitchen, where Bruno once carved his name into the pantry shelf. A joke we laughed about for weeks. And realized I had given it all away. Without knowing. The house wasn't mine. Not legally. Not anymore. The walls still had my touch. The windows still held my light. But on paper, I was a tenant. A tolerated presence. An aging woman with no ownership. The letter didn't threaten. It didn't accuse. It just erased. With a few lines of legal ink. My lifetime had been shifted. From memory to margin. And for the first time in this house, I didn't feel angry. I felt removed. Like something valuable. Someone had quietly decided. They no longer needed. I left the letter on the kitchen counter. Unfolded. Unhidden. Just sitting there. Beside the lemons Jillian insisted were good for staging. Their scent had faded. Like most things here. The paper looked out of place. In its honesty. It didn't match the curated calm of the kitchen. All morning. They passed by it. Derek with his laptop. Jillian carrying throw pillows from one room to another. They didn't pick it up. But they saw it. I know they did. By noon. The silence was heavy. I sat in the corner chair. Not my usual one. Not anymore. And watched the light shift along the floor tiles. Jillian came in first. She paused. Her hand hovered above the letter. Like she was deciding whether to touch something sharp. Then she picked it up. Carefully. Like it might crumble. She didn't look at me at first. She read. Word by word. Mouth pressed tight. I watched her breathe slower. Mom, she said finally. I didn't move. She stepped closer. Letter still in hand. You said you didn't want to deal with this kind of stuff anymore. Her voice was soft. But too polished. Like something rehearsed for a meeting. I said I didn't want to carry it all alone. I replied. That's not the same thing. She opened her mouth. Closed it. Then Derek entered. Took the letter from her hand. Folded it once. It's done, Helen, he said. It's legal. And honestly, it's simpler for everyone this way. I watched him say it. Like he believed it was kindness. Like simplicity made betrayal easier to swallow. My fingers curled slightly on my lap. Not from rage. That would have been easier. But from the coldness of being processed. A woman moved. From presence to paperwork. I trusted you, I said quietly. To take care of this place. Not take it from me. Jillian stepped forward. Eyes too wide now. Mom, it's not like that. We're still living here together. We're family. Nothing changes. I shook my head slowly. Everything changes, I said. When your name disappears from the records. It disappears from the way people speak to you. Neither answered. There was nothing left to say. I stood up. The floor creaked. A small reminder that at least it still knew my weight. And I walked away. Not loudly. Not to leave. But because I could no longer stay in the room. With people who had quietly signed me out of my own life. That evening. I made tea. Not because I was cold. But because I needed something to hold. Something that still made sense. The kettle hissed gently. the kind of sound that once signaled comfort, now just filled the silence. I didn't sit in the kitchen. I carried the cup upstairs, each step a slow return to the only place left that hadn't been claimed by staging plans and paperwork. The attic door groaned, familiar and private, a sound that belonged to me. Inside, the air held the scent of old fabric and varnish. Light from the small skylight slanted across the cedar chest. Dust floated like memory. I set the tea down, knelt beside the chest. My knees ached, but I welcomed the weight. It reminded me I was still here, still grounded. I lifted the loose floorboard, carefully, as if lifting a lid on a life I wasn't ready to let go of. There it was, Bruno's sketch, the original blueprint, rolled tight, secured with twine he had cut from the old garden stakes. I held it in my hands, felt the texture of old paper, felt the imprint of care. He'd labeled each room in pencil, his handwriting slanted, thoughtful. Studio, H. Dining, Sunday laughs. Porch, rain listening. Bedroom, us. I sat back on my heels, letting the names sink in, letting them remind me that I had once been more than the woman upstairs. I opened the photo album next. The one Derek said was too cluttered for the new vibe. First page. Our wedding day. My veil crooked. Bruno's tie too short. Both of us squinting into a sun too bright for the camera to soften. It wasn't elegant, but it was honest. I touched the corner of the photo. The edge was curling. The gloss cracked. But the image was still whole. We had started this place with borrowed tools and small hopes. Built it with hours and scraped knuckles. And a kind of love that didn't need to be explained. They could take the deed, the walls, the right to sign. But they couldn't take the origin, the intention, the memory. That blueprint wasn't just a plan. It was a vow. I folded it again. Not to hide it, but to keep it safe. Because some things, the real things, never truly belong on paper. They belong in hands, in silence, and in the rooms that remember us. Even when the names are gone. It was Jillian's idea. Of course, she framed it gently. She always did. Just for a few weeks, Mom, she said, stirring honey into her tea like she was negotiating peace. While we redo the upstairs bath and maybe the flooring. She didn't meet my eyes. Just kept stirring. Longer than necessary. Derek added, "We've already booked you a lovely suite at the Willow Ridge Lodge. It's quiet, they have a library, and the staff are great with seniors." He smiled. Like he was offering me a vacation. They had thought of everything. Transportation, meals, medication refills. I nodded. Because arguing would have made me look unreasonable. And because I wasn't sure if there was anything left to fight for out loud. But inside, something folded. Not cracked. Not shattered. Just folded. Like an envelope sealed without a letter inside. I packed slowly. Not because I needed time, but because I needed to remember. Each drawer I opened had less of me in it than it did the last time I'd looked. Half of my blouses were already gone. Donated, Jillian had said months ago. The bookshelf had been replaced with a planter that smelled faintly of citrus and nothing. My sewing kit was missing. When I asked, Jillian said, "Oh, I thought we'd put that in storage." I didn't ask where. Instead, I placed a pair of wool socks into the suitcase. Folded my nightgown beside them. Added a single book. One Bruno gave me on our 20th anniversary. He wrote inside the cover, "Because you always notice the details." I ran my thumb over the ink. It had faded, but it was still there. When the car arrived, no one rushed. Jillian hugged me briefly. Derek took my bag. Neither offered to ride with me. The driver was kind. Talked about the weather. About his niece, going to college. I nodded when appropriate, smiled once. Willow Ridge was clean, organized, comfortable. But it wasn't mine. The wallpaper was beige. The bed was too soft. There was a menu on the nightstand, listing activities for the week. Bingo. Movie night. Group walks. I stared at the list, like it belonged to someone else's future. I sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded. Room too quiet. I thought I'd feel grief. Instead, I felt something harder to name. Not sadness. Not anger. Absence. Like I'd been edited out of the sentence, but left to sit on the page. When the light faded through the curtains, I didn't turn on the lamp. I just sat there, still, as the silence filled the corners of the room, the way my memories used to fill the house. The room was quiet that night. Not peaceful. Not serene. Just quiet. Like a box with the lid closed. Dinner had come on a tray. Fish, soft vegetables, lemon pudding. I ate a little. Not because I was hungry, but because the nurse smiled so kindly. I didn't want to disappoint her. When the dishes were cleared, I lay on the unfamiliar bed, a thin quilt pulled to my chest, and stared at the ceiling. No creaks. No footsteps overhead. No faint jazz from the radio downstairs. The silence was clean. Too clean. I reached into my bag, searching for something. I didn't know what. My fingers brushed against a small leather pouch. Inside, an old cassette player. Still worked, though the buttons stuck. And one tape. Labeled in my handwriting. Art class, spring 1987. I slipped the cassette in. Pressed play. For a second, there was nothing. Then a faint crackle. Then my voice. Okay, class, let's put down our brushes and talk about what color means to you. The room inside the tape sounded alive. Pencils scratching. Chairs shifting. Laughter. A child said, "Yellow feels like running." Another chimed in, "Blue is what my dad's truck sounds like." I smiled. My voice continued. Gentle, firm. Asking questions. Inviting thought. And then I heard something I had forgotten. A younger me, saying to a student, "That's beautiful. The way you see the world matters. Don't ever let anyone paint over it." I paused the tape. The machine clicked into silence. I sat there a long time, holding the player in my lap, like it was something fragile and sacred. Tears didn't come. They would have been easier. What came instead was memory. Vivid, unasked for, unapologetic. That was my voice. Unscripted. Unsoftened. It wasn't asking permission to exist. It was teaching. Belonging. I looked around the room again. Beige walls. Neutral curtains. No photos. No books with notes in the margins. This space didn't know me. But that tape. It remembered. I pressed play again. This time, I let it run. Let her talk. Let her teach. Let her be. Because maybe, just maybe, I hadn't disappeared. Maybe I had only gone silent. Long enough to finally hear myself again. And in that moment, as my own voice echoed back to me, I understood something simple and terrifying. If everything I ever built could be taken away, with ink, with silence, with boxes, then I needed to find what they couldn't reach. Not the house. Not the deed. Me. Who I was. Before the signatures. Before the smiling removals. Before I gave it all away. Without knowing. And so I listened. Not for the students. Not for memory. But for the woman in that room. Clear. Warm. Still teaching. Still here. The next morning, I asked for paper. The nurse blinked, then smiled like I'd asked for something rare. "Do you mean a newspaper, Miss Cardillo?" "No," I said quietly. Just paper. The kind you write on. And a pen, if you have one. She returned 10 minutes later. With a yellow legal pad and a pen that clicked 3 times. Before it agreed to work. It was heavier than I remembered pens being. Maybe my hand had grown unused to weight. I sat by the window. The same one where sunlight reached the edge of my slipper. But refused to move farther in. The room was warm. Too warm. The kind of warmth that pressed down on you. Still, I welcomed it. At least it wasn't empty. I held the pen over the page. Waited. Waited some more. The first word was harder than the first sentence. I wrote. They never asked me who built the floorboards. Then, slowly. Another. They never asked what color the dining room used to be. Then. No one asked what was buried beneath the rose bush. I kept writing. Not in story. Not in order. Just lines. Fragments. The way memories arrive when no one is watching. Bruno hammered nails like they were secrets. Jillian called the attic her magic room until she turned 9. The bread always burned the first time I tried. Each sentence carried weight. Not dramatic. Not heavy. But full. Like something that had once been lived in. Like the rooms I no longer entered. I filled 1 page. Then 2. By the 4th, my hand ached. The ache felt good. It reminded me that I still existed. That I could still shape something. Even if it was just words. On a pad no one asked for. When the nurse returned to check on me, I covered the pages with my hand. She asked if I needed anything else. More paper, I said. She nodded. Softly. And didn't ask why. That night, I reread the sentences. Not to edit. Not to make sense. But to hear my voice again. There it was. Clear. Warm. Firm. The same voice that once guided 20 kids. Through a watercolor sky. The same voice that once told Jillian, you don't have to get it perfect. Just honest. So I kept writing. Because no one had asked. And because it was time. I answered anyway. I started with the front door. Not with paint or measurements. But memory. I wrote. Forest Green, Spring 1978. Painted after we lost the baby. Bruno said we needed something that felt like life. Then the foyer. That rug from my mother. It frayed early, scratched your ankles. We never replaced it. It was stubborn, like her. I moved slowly. Room by room. Line by line. Each sentence was a brushstroke. Each page a layer of the house. Only I could see now. The kitchen took 3 pages. 3rd cabinet. Jam jars reused for buttons, nails, safety pins. Bruno's hands always smelled like cinnamon and sawdust in that room. The stove never sat level. Bruno wedged a penny under the back leg. It's still there, I think. We never locked that window. Said if a thief wanted in that badly, he deserved the good china. I chuckled softly when I wrote that. Then felt tears. Not from pain. But from presence. It was all still there. In me. Even if it had vanished from their version of the house. I reached the dining room next. Every Thanksgiving, the light hit that corner just right. Bruno said it made the turkey look like it came from heaven. Jillian spilled gravy there age 6. Tried to mop it up with her dress. The attic, I saved for last. Because it was the one place they hadn't touched. Cedar chest, left corner. Smells like lavender and thyme. Loose floorboard, marked with a B in pencil. Only we knew why. Then I added a line I hadn't expected. If anyone finds this, remember, this wasn't just a house. It was a person's life. I stared at it. Then underlined it. Twice. I leaned back in the chair. Hand aching. Paper stack warm on my lap. The nurse peeked in. More tea, Miss Cardillo? I nodded. Please. And another pad if you have one. She smiled. Writing a novel? No, I said. Just reclaiming square footage. She laughed softly. Didn't ask for more. When she left, I took a clean page. At the top, I wrote, Chapter 1, The House That Remembered Me. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't a declaration. It was a beginning. The first brick. And something they couldn't gut renovate. Something I didn't need a signature to own. I stared at the stack of pages, spread across the desk. Some were creased. Others curled at the corners. A few had faint stains from tea or tired hands. But every line was mine. They weren't stories. They were anchors. Little weights of truth. That kept me from drifting out of memory. For 2 days, I wrote. Without pause. Without needing anyone to ask. But that morning, as sunlight crept over the windowsill, a question whispered through the quiet. What now? I thought about burning the pages. A small fire. Private. A goodbye no one could interrupt. But the idea didn't settle. It felt like defeat dressed as ceremony. Then I remembered Jamie. Jamie Bennett. A boy with paint under his fingernails. And silence tucked behind his eyes. He was 12 when he entered my class. He never raised his hand. But he always stayed late. His mother was tired. His father had left. And his paintings were always blue. One afternoon, he asked if silence had a color. I told him yes. I told him silence was the color of early morning. He painted with yellow after that. Then green. Years later, a postcard arrived. Portland. He had become a journalist. Still painted. Still remembered. I never wrote back. I wasn't sure he meant for me to. But I kept the card. Pressed it into an old cookbook. Between pages for cranberry scones. And lemon bars I hadn't made in years. Now, I found that card again. Edges soft. Ink slightly faded. But his words still held. Thank you for seeing what I wasn't ready to say. So I gathered the pages. Tied them gently. With an old ribbon. From a birthday long ago. I placed them in an envelope. No return address. Just. For Jamie, this is what they erased. When the nurse brought in tea, I handed it to her. Could you mail this for me? She glanced at the thickness. Is it a manuscript? I smiled, faintly. Something like that. She nodded. Didn't ask more. Bless her for that. That night, I sat at the window again. The air smelled faintly of rain. And for the first time in weeks, I felt weightless. Not from loss, but from release. They had taken the house. The name. The walls. But not the story. Not the voice. And as the sky darkened, I whispered aloud. They may own the house. But the story still belongs to me. The envelope came on a Tuesday. Not an email. Not a phone call. Just paper. Cream-colored. Handwritten address. The nurse carried it in on top of the lunch tray. Tilted slightly, so the soup didn't spill. You got something nice today, she said. Her voice gentle. Like she could already feel it mattered. I waited until the door clicked shut. Until the hallway was still. Then I reached for it. The name on the return address made my fingers pause. Jamie Bennett. Portland, Oregon. I hadn't seen his name in years. Not since that postcard tucked into my old cookbook. The envelope felt soft around the edges. As if it had been held too long before sending. I opened it slowly. As if peeling back a layer of the past I wasn't sure I wanted to touch. Inside. One letter. Typed. One page. Miss Cardillo. I read your pages. All of them. Twice. Then I sat with them in silence. Like I used to in your classroom. Not because I didn't understand. But because I didn't want the moment to end. You taught me silence could be full. That stillness had shape. And your words. They haven't lost that. They breathe. They ache. They remember. I don't know what was taken from you. But I know what remains. And it's enough. More than enough. If you're willing, I'd like to help tell your story. No edits. No embellishments. Just truth. Wrapped in your voice. Guided by care. Small at first. Local. But true. I'll wait to hear from you. And thank you for still being the kind of teacher who teaches even without a classroom. Jamie. I held the page in my hands until my palms felt the warmth of it. Not because it was heavy, but because it carried something back to me I hadn't felt in years. Permission. Not from a bank. Not from a daughter. But from someone who had once listened and still knew how. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it carefully, set it beside the teacup, and stared out the window. I thought of the attic. The quilt. The blueprint under the floorboard. Things they couldn't erase. That evening, I wrote a reply. Just one line. Let the house speak. And for the first time, I didn't feel invisible. I felt inevitable. Jamie didn't come with a recorder. No laptop. No agenda sheet. Just a notebook. The kind with soft edges and coffee stains. And a pen that clicked only once. He found me by the lounge window. Same chair, same teacup. The world unchanged. Except for the small flutter in my chest. We exchanged pleasantries. But he didn't linger in the polite. I want to begin wherever you want to begin, he said. His voice still had that slow, careful rhythm. Like he was building a bridge. Between silence and story. I looked out the window. Then down at my hands. They'd always been steady. But now they were folded like questions. I said, start in the kitchen. His pen moved instantly. No hesitation. I told him about the tile behind the stove. How it chipped when Bruno dropped the cast iron pan. How we laughed so hard. He decided to never fix it. Some scars, he said, shouldn't be covered. Jamie smiled. Didn't speak. Let the ink catch up to the memory. I told him how I used to hide small notes. In Jillian's lunchbox. Tiny sketches of trees. A bird? Once a bowl of soup with steam that looked like music. And how Jillian used to pin them to the wall in the hallway. Until she turned 13. And said they made her too different. I stopped. Took a sip of the weak tea. Jamie didn't fill the space. He waited. Let me return on my own terms. Then he asked, what do you want them to remember? Not about the house. But about you? My breath caught. Not because the question was difficult. But because it was unfamiliar. No one had ever asked. Not in that way. I stared at the steam rising from the cup. It curled gently. Like something hesitant, but determined. I want them to remember that I was gentle, I said. Not soft. Not invisible. But gentle. Jamie nodded. Wrote without breaking eye contact. I kept going. That I noticed things. Like when the sparrows stopped coming. Or when Bruno's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. I paused. And that I stayed. Even when no one asked me to. Even when they forgot I had a name. He underlined something in his notebook. Then looked at me and said, I'll be back tomorrow, if that's all right. I nodded. After he left, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like a door had opened. And this time, someone had walked in. Not to take, but to see. Jamie returned the next morning. No camera. No microphone. Just his notebook. Creased and slightly curled at the edges. As if it had spent the night thinking too. We sat in the small sunroom this time. The fern above us swayed with the ceiling fan. Sunlight filtered through pale curtains, casting faint patterns on the floor. He opened the notebook. Flipped back a few pages. I've been working on a title, he said. Soft, like a question in disguise. He read aloud. The house that forgot her name. The words hung between us. I didn't flinch. But something shifted quietly inside. It's not wrong, I said. But I don't know if it's right either. Jamie nodded. He didn't defend it. Didn't explain. I guess it's easy to name what's missing, I added. Harder to name what remains. He waited, pen resting against the page. Always patient. Always open. I don't want the story to be about what they took, I said. I want it to be about what I kept. Jamie lifted the pen. Didn't write yet. Just looked at me, fully present. Then tell me, he said. And I did. I told him about the blueprint. How Bruno had drawn it on the back of a receipt. From the hardware store. How he labeled each room with a note instead of a name. Studio. H. Dining. Sunday laughs. Porch. Rain listening. I told him I kept the chipped teacup. From our first apartment. The one we used even after the handle broke. I told him I kept every drawing Jillian made. Before she turned 10. Even the ones she scribbled on the backs of envelopes. I told him I kept the habit of noticing. How the light changed with the season. How silence could say different things depending on the hour. He wrote it all down. Word for word. Then paused. What if, he said slowly, we changed the title? I tilted my head. Waiting. He looked at me, not the page. The woman who remembered everything. The words settled in me. Like warm tea on a cold morning. Not flashy. Not loud. But true. I looked out the window. 2 finches fluttered at the feeder. The sky beyond them a quiet blue. I turned back to him and nodded. This time, I said. We tell it on my terms. Jamie smiled. Closed the notebook. And sat with me in the hush that followed. Not to finish. But to honor what was finally beginning. It went live on a Thursday morning. Not in a magazine. Not on a national platform. Just a quiet column titled, Local Lives. On the Portland Observer's modest website. No fanfare. No bright headline. Just an email from Jamie. It's time. I read it at the shared computer in the Willow Ridge lounge. The machine was slow. The mouse a little sticky. And the keyboard made a faint hum each time I typed. The browser opened eventually. Jamie had sent the direct link. And there it was. A photograph, grainy, black and white. Of my front porch. Not the polished, renovated one. The original steps. With the crack on the third riser. Bruno said gave it character. Below that. The woman who remembered everything. My name was in the byline. Spelled right. Unitalicized. Ho. The first sentence wasn't about what was lost. It was about the color of the front door. Forest green in 1978, painted after grief. Because some things need new names after old endings. Jamie hadn't written a piece. He'd written a room. Each paragraph a window. Each quote a floorboard. He didn't name Jillian or Derek. Not once. He let memory do the revealing. He let silence tell its own truth. There were my words. Italicized. Tucked like museum notes under old photographs. I don't want the story to be about what they took. I want it to be about what I kept. I read slowly. Not because I couldn't keep up. But because I didn't want it to end. My hands trembled slightly on the mouse. Not from shock. But from recognition. By late afternoon. The comments section had opened. At first, a trickle. Then steady. My mother had a cup just like that. This woman sounds like a lighthouse. I read this out loud to my daughter. Not outrage. Not gossip. Echoes. Then, quietly. An email. Subject. We'd like to talk. From Oregon Preservation Alliance. A local nonprofit. The message was clear. We believe homes carry stories. We'd like to help preserve yours. Would you be open to a conversation? I didn't respond right away. I just sat there. The cursor blinking at the edge of the message. The light from the window. Warm on my forearm. For the first time in years. My story was out in the world. And I hadn't had to fight to be heard. Only remember. Only stay. They came on a Monday. Not with folders full of contracts. Not with glossy brochures. Just one woman. Wearing a navy cardigan and sensible shoes. with a quiet smile that didn't push itself forward. Her name was Elise Calder. She introduced herself with a warmth that didn't require noise. "Thank you for having me, Mrs. Cardillo." I corrected her gently. "Just Helen." She nodded. "Then I'm Elise." We sat in the sunroom. The light fell soft across the table, and the teacup beside me cast a small oval shadow that trembled slightly with the breeze. "I work with the Oregon Preservation Alliance," she began. "And I want to be clear. We didn't come to claim anything." That line disarmed me more than any apology. She reached into her canvas bag and brought out a manila folder, worn at the corners, as if it had been read often. Inside were drawings, hand-sketched renderings of the house. Not the version Jillian had modernized. Not the Airbnb version with Edison bulbs and soulless neutrals. These were warm, personal. Someone had drawn the porch with the crooked third step, even noting the hairline crack Bruno never patched. "We've read Jamie's article," she said. "More than once. We felt something in it. And we wondered if you'd help us see the house as it once was." I studied the drawings. "The attic hatch sticks in winter," I said. "Unless you lift it just so." She took out a pencil and wrote it down, word for word. "Would you be willing," she asked carefully, "to guide us through, as a kind of oral historian? Your voice, your pace. Nothing changed without your approval." The question came, not like a proposal, but like an invitation. I blinked. My throat tightened. "Yes," I said. "But only if you understand. This isn't about bringing it back. It never left. They just stopped listening." Elise met my eyes. "I do understand. We're not here to reclaim the house. We're here to let it speak in its own language." She didn't stay long after that. But when she stood to go, she said something that stayed. "You're not a footnote in this place, Helen. You're the author." I watched her walk away down the corridor. And for the first time in years, I felt like the rooms behind me were no longer closing, but quietly waiting to open again. They didn't call, didn't knock, didn't leave a note. They just left. The SUV pulled up quietly. No screeching tires, no slammed doors. Derek loaded their suitcases with the same precision he used when measuring wall space for artistic upgrades. Jillian stood still by the porch. She didn't go inside, didn't linger, just watched the house, like someone waiting for it to tell her if it would forgive. From Elise's office window, across the street, I watched them. Not hidden, not dramatic, just present. The windows of the house looked darker that day. The paint, a little more honest in its wear. The railing chipped at the edge. Exactly where Jillian used to balance herself as a child. Arms spread like wings. Now, she stood inches from it, but didn't touch. For a brief second, her hand hovered, fingertips grazing the air, as if some part of her wanted to return. But return to what? A version of me she no longer knew? A version of the house she tried to repaint into silence? She dropped her hand, straightened her posture. Derek called to her from the car. He didn't step out, didn't look back. She turned away from the house. Her heels clicked twice on the pavement. Then she climbed into the passenger seat. The engine started. And just like that, they were gone. No final word. No claim. No goodbye. Only absence. Clean and irreversible. I crossed the street slowly. Up the porch steps. Every board remembered me. Not by name, but by weight. Inside, the kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon. Or maybe that was memory. I walked through each room. No more Airbnb soaps. No scent diffusers. Just the hum of something returning. The cedar chest was still in the attic. The teacup still sat on the sill, and tucked behind a cookbook. The blueprint Bruno sketched 42 years ago. On the back of a receipt. My name wasn't on the deed. But it was in the walls. In the tile. in the way the afternoon light still kissed the west corner. I sat down at the kitchen table, ran my hand along the surface, felt the faint carving. J-I-L. Still there, worn but legible. And I whispered. Not to them. Not to myself. But to the house. I stayed. Even when they didn't see me. Even when they tried to leave me out. I stayed. The first visitors arrived on a Sunday afternoon. Not in tour buses. Not with brochures. Just in pairs. Quietly. Mostly women. Mostly older. Some came with daughters. Some came alone. They stood at the gate for a moment, reading the brass plaque recently installed by the Oregon Preservation Alliance. The Cardillo House, a living archive of memory. Underneath, curated by Helen Cardillo, former art teacher, widow, and keeper of stories. When I first saw that inscription, I cried. Not loud. Not shaking. Just one slow tear. Down each cheek. Because it wasn't about being honored. It was about being named. The house didn't look new. It looked familiar. The third porch step still creaked. The green door still leaned ever so slightly to the left. But inside, nothing had been restored. Things had been returned. The kitchen table, with my daughter's initials faintly carved beneath, stood at its original spot. The quilt I'd sewn in 1989 was back on the sofa, creased and warm. And in the attic, they'd left everything exactly as it was. Except now, there was a small wooden stool and a circle of headphones where people could sit and listen to my voice, tell the story of the roof, the rafters, and the quiet. I hadn't wanted to speak at the opening, but Elise asked gently, if not for the public, then maybe for the house? So I agreed. We didn't host a ribbon cutting. We hosted tea, chamomile, cinnamon cookies, soft jazz on the old radio. At 3 o'clock, I stood by the fireplace and said, I lived in this house for 42 years, and for a time, I was made to feel as though I was its ghost. But ghosts don't remember birthdays. Ghosts don't stir soup. Ghosts don't cry in kitchens. Because a chipped mug held the same smell as someone they once loved. The room was silent. I let it breathe. Then added, this house was never haunted. It was inhabited. By laughter. By grief. By the kind of noticing you only learn after 60. There were no cheers. No clapping. Just nods. Tears quietly dabbed with tissues. Pulled from cardigans. Afterward, a woman in her 80s came to me holding a folded napkin. She said, my husband built our house with his hands too. After he died, they changed the locks without asking. But I still remember which floorboard squeaks when I miss him most. We stood there, two strangers, one memory. And in that moment, I understood. This house wasn't just mine. It was ours. A vessel for everything too quiet to shout, but too sacred to forget. By winter, the house no longer felt like a house. It felt like breath, like a pulse steady beneath old floorboards. People came not for spectacle, but for stillness, for stories, for a kind of remembering that didn't rush. Sometimes, they didn't even speak. They just wandered room to room, hands in coat pockets, pausing to look at things that would mean nothing to anyone who hadn't lived a life of watching others forget. A jar of buttons, a faded recipe card, a scarf draped over the back of a wooden chair. They asked about Bruno, about the day we bought the cedar chest, about the paint color in the dining room. Was it always that warm? And I'd smile, not to perform, but to offer. Yes. It was warm because we let the morning in first. One afternoon, a girl no older than 10 sat beside me on the front steps. Her mother was inside, listening to one of the attic recordings. The girl looked at me with wide, serious eyes. Are you the lady from the story? I paused, then nodded. I suppose I am. She leaned a little closer. Did it really happen? All that forgetting? I thought of Jillian's hand, hovering above the railing but never touching. I thought of how silence can look like obedience. But sometimes, it's just gathering. Yes, I said softly. But I remembered anyway. She blinked. And after a while, she reached into her coat and handed me a folded piece of paper. Inside was a drawing. A house. A woman in a chair. A window. And above it, in child's handwriting, "You are not invisible." I keep that note in the drawer, beside my favorite spoon. For rainy days. For days the light shifts too fast. Some weeks later, a new plaque was added beside the door. It reads, "This home is dedicated to the quiet keepers. To those who were told to step aside, but stayed anyway. To those whose hands built things no one remembered to thank them for. To those who did not raise their voice, but raised generations." I didn't write those words, but they came from me. From every cup of tea. From every box I didn't throw away. From every story I told. Even when no one asked. Now, they ask. Not just about me, but about themselves. Visitors leave notes in a little wooden box near the exit. Some just say, "Thank you." Others, "I'm still here, too." And a few, "My daughter doesn't call anymore, but I remember the sound of her laugh." I read them at night. Not to feel important, but to feel among. The house is quieter now, but not empty. Each room holds a breath, a name, a softness too stubborn to disappear. And when I sit by the window, watching the light move across the floor, I feel it. Not victory. Not closure. Something better. Continuance. We invite you to share your own memories below. Not just the loud ones, but the ones you kept folded in drawers, pressed between pages, or buried beneath silence. You are not invisible. You are not alone.